When creating a dynamic workbook that you know that people are going to be interacting with, it can be very valuable to replace some of your normal functions with either the subtotal function or the aggregate function. This allows you to summarize the data while somebody is filtering and interacting with the data. So let's take a look at subtotal first as our first example. If you have a data set like this one, right, we have a region categorization, for example. There's a lot of possibility behind using things like sum ifs to filter down and just show you the grand total for east or west, things like that. But what does subtotal do for us? What subtotal does is it allows you inside of the parentheses to specify which function you'd like to apply, and then which cells you'd like that function to work on, and then the subtotal function does its job without much other input. Now, interestingly here, when you specify what function you want to apply, you have to use one of a numbered list. There are 11 possible functions that can be used inside the subtotal function. Probably the most common ones are going to be things like average, count, and sum. And as you can see here, if I use the number value 1 through 11, what it does is it says, I'm going to total this up only on the visible rows after you've done some filtering. You also have another possibility, however, and usually I choose from this list instead. Similar to 1 through 11, we now have 101 through 111 for the exact same functions, but this time around to say, only show me the results of the values that are still visible, whether we're filtering them or we have manually hid them. So for example here, let's say we take this data set, we apply a filter to it, and we hide all of the west region. Well, the subtotal function, whether you use the number 9 or the number 109, would give you the sum total of these three values. On the other hand, if I went in and I manually hid arc from this list, then it would only add up the two that are still visible if I chose 109. But if I chose 9, then arc would still be included in the sum. Let's see that in a real workbook here. So as you can see, I very easily here have a count A function for the number of employees and a sum function for the total salary. But in both instances, if I go to the department drop-down menu and I filter out people who work in operations, you'll notice that these two number values do not change. It still says 28 and 3 million. Let me clear the filter on that to come back. And that's because sum and count don't care about filters. So here in cell L7, I'm going to do a count function. Now, interestingly here, if you don't have the numbers that are associated with these functions easily at hand, it's actually easier to hand write the subtotal function because the list is given to you in a dropdown. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. If I go to the Formulas tab, go to the Math and Trig dropdown menu, and I find the subtotal function here under the dropdown, you'll see here that it tells me simply to put a number 1 through 11 that specifies the summary function. And if I click in here and I type in the number 1, it's not really helping me. See that right there? It's not telling me that this is the average function. So you could look it up, but typically when I'm using the subtotal function, my normal MO is to type in =subtotal. And as soon as I do, the dropdown gives me that benefit. So now I can scroll through here and find the count A function that takes into account both filtered and manually hidden rows. So I'll choose count A at 103 here, press tab, and then after the comma, simply highlight all of the last names, and close the parentheses. Now this should give me the exact same result as the count A function, 28 right there. So subtotal and count A both give me the result of 28. Now, on the other hand, if I come in here for department and I filter out finance, for example, and click OK, I now see that there are 28 total employees, but 24 employees who are not in finance, who are still visible after the filter's been applied. And then choose to unfilter the data, and we're back to having 28 total employees. And the same thing goes for the subtotal function if I choose one of the sum options. Equal sign subtotal. And this time I will choose the sum function, which is 9 instead of 109, because I want to see whether manually hiding the rows has an effect on it. So I'll choose 9 for summing all of the unfiltered rows, comma, and then I'll highlight all that's in the salary column, close the parentheses and hit enter. And as you can see, it's again $3,002,000. But if I come in and I choose to filter out all of the finance people, that now gets me down to $2.5 million because, of course, we've hidden everybody who's in finance through the use of the filter. Now, on the other hand, if I were to clear this filter and simply manually hide some of my rows by right-clicking and choosing Hide, you see here that this number value has not changed. The number value up here has changed because we used 103 instead of 3. The number here hasn't changed because we used 9 instead of 109. Again, I will select, right-click, and unhide, and all of those results come back. So let's talk about what's different about aggregate. Because aggregate is trying to do very similar things to what subtotal is trying for, but doing it in a slightly different way. So once again, we have a data set, and maybe we have some regions that we want to filter by, and instead of using subtotal, we use aggregate. Now aggregate, you'll notice here, has a function number argument, just like subtotal did, but it also has an options argument. Now interestingly here, instead of the 1 through 11 and then 101 through 111 that subtotal had, we now have 1 through 19, where we have several additional functions: median, mode, large, small, percentile, and quartile. I would still assume that you're going to be using average and count and sum the majority of the time, but having additional functions is definitely a benefit. But if this is the case, then why would we have something different from 101, 102? Why would we have this options selection? Well, when you see your options, you get a new number value, 0 through 7, and it's about what is allowed to be ignored. And potentially the most interesting of those is if you have gone into your data and decided to put aggregate or subtotal functions within your data, then the aggregate function can ignore the aggregate functions that are inside of your data. It can, of course, here ignore all the hidden cells, but it can also ignore error values. And so it can ignore these in all three of these options in all the different combinations. So we can ignore, for number 4, we can ignore nothing. For number 5, we can ignore the hidden rows. For number 6, we can ignore the error values. And for number 0, we can ignore the subtotal and aggregate functions. And then 1, 2, 3, and 7 are different combinations of those things. So I would say very often I'm using the number 3 because I think that ignoring errors, hidden rows, and the subtotal or aggregate functions is a good place to be for a lot of scenarios. But you can also see not ignoring error messages, for example. So let's try this out in a real workbook. So in the same way as the subtotal function, I do prefer to manually type the aggregate function so that my options are on a drop-down rather than having to look them up manually. So if I go to cell L7 and I do =aggregate, you can see here that first it gives us the 1 through 19 of the functions that we're allowed to use. So I will use my down arrow to select the number 3 for the count A function and press the tab key in order to select it. And now after the comma, we here have all the different possibilities of what is allowed to be ignored. Like I said, very often here I'm choosing the option 3, which of course ignores it if it's being hidden, ignores it if it's an error message, and ignores it if it is a subtotal or aggregate function inside of the data. So I'll choose 3 and press tab. And then finally, after the comma, I can select the range of cells. Oh, not that one. There we go. This range of cells over here and close the parentheses and hit enter. And again, I see that same number 28. Now let's go ahead and do the second aggregate function here, =aggregate. This time we will use the sum function, which is option 9, and press tab. And then after the comma, once again, we will choose option 3, and then comma, finally selecting all of these salaries, closing the parentheses and hitting enter, and we see again 3,200,000 or 3,002,000. Now, what are we going to see if we simply filter? Of course, we're going to use the drop-down menu here for department, filter out finance, and click OK. And we see the subsets, 24 employees, $2.575 million. I will now expand this and clear the filter. What happens if we sort by department? Let me sort here, A to Z. And then into the middle of the data, let's say I'm interested in the aggregate function showing me everything above operations. So I will right-click on row 21, insert a new row right there, and now I'll come in and I will do an aggregate function here, =aggregate, using the sum function. And ignoring hidden rows, error values, and nested subtotal and aggregate functions. And then finally, selecting the array of cells directly above, closing the parentheses. Now, everybody pay very close attention to what happens to the total salary here, because I'm about to add up all of the salaries above row 21, which is going to give me a big number in the middle of the salary column. So what's going to happen is total salary should increase really significantly. I hit enter on my keyboard, and you see right there, this aggregate function knows that the total real salary is still $3 million because it's ignoring the $1.684 million that's here. This sum function over on the right is not smart enough to ignore that number value, and so it got bigger as a result. So interestingly here, if we decide to use aggregate really substantially throughout our data to summarize things as we're working and then also summarize at the end, we will get a much better result than if we're using your basic sum functions.